Alrighty, and we are live. Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Zlaya from Daily Kos. I'm the content strategist here, and I'm joined here. I'm so excited by my colleague, Aysha Qamar. She's a trending news writer, and she is one of the newest members of our Daily Kos family. So, Aysha, hi, how are you?
Hi, super excited to be here too. And I'm like looking forward to talking to you in general because it's always been a pleasure.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourselves? Tell the audience, what your work has been in the past, what you've been doing now for, gosh, how long have you been with Daily Kos now?
A year, like, exactly a year and
Exactly a year.
a week and a year, yeah.
Time flies. Today is my Kos-anniversary, so I've been here for 2 years
Oh,
now. So yeah, but let the audience know a little about yourself.
okay, so before I came here, I was working in domestic violence and sexual assault. But as a linguistic counselor, so I worked with people who had limited English proficiency, so LEP survivors, mainly in the South Asian community, and I worked as a legal advocate because my background is in policy. So I would work to kind of help individuals learn what their rights were, not obviously not giving them legal advice, but just interpreting legal paperwork that they might have. I would do court accompaniments, and then I worked on language access for the state. So I worked with the Division of Women in New Jersey to come up with a language access plan that focused on bringing language access and justice to individuals who don't speak English and often struggle through the legal system. While I was doing that.
Incredible.
I know it so much. While I was doing that, I used to write on the side for fun. So it was kind of like my side hustle, freelance work. And I always wanted to do it full time, but I think because of the cultural stigma that writing wasn't a South Asian field, I never really kind of thought that it could happen. And then one day, I don't know, I just took the leap to apply. And the funny thing is, the same week that I got an offer, an interview with here, I also got an interview with a job in policy. And it was kind of like that. Do I take that route of, what my family's always imagined for me, what I always thought I would do, or do I take that dream job that I don't know when's going to come? And obviously here I am. We all know how that worked out.
That's amazing. Honestly, it's really funny because, we both come from immigrant communities. I'm Latina, and when I was applying for a job here, I was in second round interviews for a policy job in housing myself. And I was like, oh, and I had done polling before, and I had gotten an offer from a polling firm, and I was like, I don't know. And I took this job as well. I'm so glad that we both took the leap. So that's really exciting. We're here to talk a lot about culture and identity today, which is interesting because both of our backgrounds into Daily Kos are so weighted with that culture and identity, right? And everything that has been going on in the past week is, been intrinsically tied because everything that is personal is political. So I kind of wanted to check in real time with you. And by the way, to the 126 people watching us right now, hello. If you have any questions for Aysha, please go ahead and leave it, or just any comments. We're reading everything in real time. We'd love to have this conversation with you. But as someone who's been covering the past week on our trending news team, what's that been like for you, and what angle have you taken to really conceptualize what's going on?
So honestly speaking, I've been mainly focusing on so today I wrote some good news that I love writing all the time because I feel like it's kind of it's different when you see a lot of news that happens that's sad. I like writing roundups, so I worked on a few of those that had to do with people who were said to be on the no-fly list. Well, this wasn't confirmed. These videos were going viral on Twitter on that, so I think that I like to take that approach to kind of bring some humor into these kind of situations because I personally too, honestly speaking, when I clock out, I try not to look at the news too much throughout the day because I'm like, okay, I need a break.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of bring that in. Today, literally a couple of minutes ago, we put up a story about Eugene Goodman, who just is congressman. A few congressmen want to offer him an award for all the for being a hero in general during the riots.
This was the police officer who was able to
divert everyone, away from the chambers. So honestly speaking, there wasn't a certain angle that I was taking. It was kind of just Yeah. I feel like so much happened. It's kind of it's hard to like process. I know like I was thinking about writing a story. I haven't gotten around to it because I just can't like put my kind of my thoughts into words yet, but
Mhm.
about how like whenever these kind of things happen, unfortunately, white supremacists aren't called, now they're starting to be called domestic terrorists. That doesn't
Right.
often happen. And my first thought was, I was thinking like when I saw these stories going up, when it was happening last Wednesday was, why isn't anyone calling them terrorists?
Right.
Because the first thing people say when it comes to any community of color is they're criminals, they're terrorists, but this was kind of like, oh, Trump supporters. And it's like, why just protesters and supporters? So
Yeah.
that was, I guess that's like my thought process that I'm still kind of following.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's been so many, I live on since I do our social media, I like live on Twitter and reading what people are saying. And there was so many of this, like, well, imagine if this had been Obama, or imagine if this had been a group of brown or black people. And it's like, we wouldn't even have even gotten there. Like it wouldn't
Yeah.
have gotten to the level that it was. People would have been on no-fly lists weeks before, because it's not like these groups weren't announcing exactly what they were planning on
Mhm.
doing. And that's the negative, horrible thing that's been happening. But we
Yeah.
are about to inaugurate Vice President Kamala Harris, which I know you're very excited about and you've written about. And I just want to know from your perspective, how significant is this moment, and has it felt like it's a little tempered because of just the past 2 years, or how are you feeling,
I feel like
basically?
so I have like I'm really excited representation wise to see this happening. Honestly speaking, there are like some things of course I don't agree with. So it's not like I'm like, oh my God, but representation wise, it's really exciting. So I did identify as South Asian, I'm Pakistani. And I've seen throughout these years, like so many people who are South Asian have been going into politics. I was actually helping someone recently just like look over a list because they asked me if I could just proof one of their pieces that they were submitting elsewhere. And it was a roundup of South Asian people who won elections. And
Yeah.
honestly, I was like shocked to see how many people there were and how many people ran. And then
Yeah.
similar to that, I wrote a roundup about how many people won who identified as Muslim or South Asian. And I had about 33 Muslim people who won. And I was like, what? Like, I wasn't expecting that. As I was going through the list, like, it's like sad to say, but I wasn't expecting to have that many people.
Mhm.
And then it kept like increasing over time. But yeah, no, I think it's so exciting because in general, having that representation, and not only is she South Asian, but she's Black. So that's like, whoa,
Yeah.
no, it's like a double win. And it's really, it's like cool to see that because I know like growing up, I was always into politics and like everyone was kind of like, no, like, and it was more like and the funny thing is like my background, like from being my family being from Pakistan, we did have a prime minister who was a woman. And
Mhm.
it's like interesting that despite that, when you talk about it here, people are like, and
Right.
then I would say like in the last 5 years in general, there have been 2 Muslim women mayors too.
Mhm.
And that's like, and they're Pakistani. So seeing that first, and then now seeing someone as vice president, it's like, whoa, like, okay, it became like realistic to see someone as mayor or in like local politics, but then seeing them on the national level, like outside of being just in Congress, when you first see that, like, with everyone coming in, I don't know, it's like a lot of emotions, I would say.
Yeah.
I remember when the ticket was announced, like my entire like social media feed was like blowing up with people like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. And
Right.
it's just like it's like crazy to think about it. And I think the funniest video I saw was someone made like a TikTok video of Kamala Harris, like they were like dressed with like a wig, and they this guy did, and he was like doing bhangra, and then he was like and then he was like doing other dances, and he's like, oh, going into like the White House, like, and I don't know, it's like funny to think like I feel like there was just so much energy in that, and it was
Yeah.
nice to see that with like all the horrible things Trump has been doing, to just have
Yeah.
like positive vibes coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I fully hear you. And, there's a lot of really great organizations that we have partnered with in the past years. She the People is the first one that I think about that was specifically centered around women of color and women of color running for office. And obviously you and I are both extremely passionate about that. But I tweeted something about this last night because I was watching a Brene Brown special, and she's she does a lot of research on social work, and she talks about vulnerability being the same thing as courage, right? And I tweeted something about this, being like, remind me someone to write an article about comparing this vulnerability being courage, and the power that AOC specifically has, this chord that she seems to be hitting with people, where people like despise AOC because they're threatened by, to me, her vulnerability and her power. And yet those of us who love AOC are like, God, her vulnerability and her power is like what does it. And Amy Allison was very kind, who runs She the People, and she was talking, she said to me, she's like, I would love to hear this conversation more. And so I want to bring this conversation here, where it's like there is something, and of course women of color is such a broad scope of so many different cultures and identities even within that, right? Because that includes everything from trans Black women to, you know, like completely, you know, like Black culture, like first immigration, like there's just so much that goes into that. But there does seem to be this strength in us in seizing our identities, and people talk about that being identity politics, right? And how we're like playing some sort of character. And to me, it's like, what are you talking about? That's finally being able to embrace the side of who I am. So I want to know from your work, because especially from your background, where you have specifically worked in these communities, if you still feel that there is a hesitance of people in telling their stories, or if you have noticed in the past years that it has changed and it has emboldened folks.
I think it depends, right? So I feel like it goes with the movement. So specifically when I was working in domestic violence, I know when the Me Too movement first came out, a lot of people were like, okay, this movement is great, but it excludes people of color. And I remember like, one of the biggest things we like talked about that was like reclaiming that narrative. But then it comes around, right? Like every single culture has different stigmas and different kind of like, I guess, norms that people have followed. And I would say like my background being like South Asian and Muslim, people often kind of confuse like the differences of the culture and the religion, and they clash in some places. So the stigmas that aren't present in the Muslim community are present in the South Asian community and vice versa. So what I've seen, and like, I mean, I kind of struggle with that too. And even with my writing sometimes, and I've had this conversation with like Jessica and Jen a few times, where I'm like, I want to write this, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, you know, like, am I there yet? And there's a lot of pieces that like I've thought of in the same sense, right? And it goes back to like, I think that like I'm kind of like, it's like embedded in my mind, like that I can't like do this or I can't do that. But I definitely have seen a change over time. Specifically, like I know with my community is like first coming up with the issues with like divorce, right? That was a very big stigma, and that's kind of like slowly gone away. Then it went away with careers, like the gender norms, right? So now we see a lot of women in South Asian communities and communities of color in general, just like rising up in positions that people never really thought to see anyone in. Of that race. So not just women, but just seeing people of color in those positions. But I think it's also like depends. I personally think it varies from culture to culture, because there are issues that I see right away. People talk about like when it comes to Islamophobia, I see all my like Muslim allies and Muslim friends like quickly speaking up about that. But then there's issues, for example, when it comes to like Black Lives Matter, right? You don't see as many South Asian people speaking up about that because they benefit from it. So I think that there's like so many different like identities that kind of fall into different places that it really depends. I would say I started seeing people speak up about Black Lives Matter more when, but they would compare it to colorism. And I felt like that was taking away, sometimes taking away like the awareness is supposed to be needed. So for example, and that kind of goes into identity politics. And I've like talked to a few people about that as well, where they say when you're talking about colorism in the South Asian community, then you bring up Black Lives Matter. It's like, okay, yeah, South Asians have a history of colorism, but we shouldn't take that attention away from what's going on right now and what the movement is for Black lives. And I think that happens a lot. So that also kind of people get afraid in a sense to speak up about certain things, because they're like, oh, like, what if I offend someone by saying this? And I kind of saw that. And I feel like the one big thing I saw this year that changed was with all these people becoming more relevant in the media and more representation, people were able to like talk about these things more, because there was more like workshops on how you can address like, you know, like the traumas that your culture has faced without kind of over speaking over someone or taking away the mic from someone else who should be like getting that the awareness for. So like, if that makes sense. But I
Yeah,
don't know if
absolutely.
I answered your question, but I feel like there's just so many different things that are going on that I still think the silence is there. And I think it's also because culture isn't just like your identity itself, it's also family to family, right? So you
Yeah.
could be the same exact identity, but your like home culture might be completely different than someone else. And I think that's what kind of factors in a lot of the times with certain people. Like if they're living at home and with COVID, you might be less likely to be open about talking about something because you live with your parents, or like you live
Yeah.
with like family members or somebody who you might not be comfortable speaking about this with. So
Yeah.
I don't know, there's like a lot of
There's so much to unpack there. And the issue of colorism is something that is very prevalent too in the Latinx community. There's constant conversations going on right now about I have unbelievable white passing privilege because of the way that I look, because of the way that I present. The Afro-Latino community has often been stigmatized and completely shunned, even within the Latinx community. And it is this thing. And then the other side of it too is that people of color in general are, I think a lot of activists, we hold ourselves to like a higher standard than we hold our white allies. And
yeah.
that's also a conversation that, has been unfolding a lot, especially after the election. There's been a lot of conversations about Latin American voters and Latinx voters and, how liberal are they and this, that, and the other. And then there's like these unbelievable, overwhelming numbers of conservative white people. And I'm like, yes, we can have this conversation, but like,
Yeah,
there are
I get that.
also other problems that aren't just coming from the big umbrella blanket that is people of color. So it's difficult, right? Because as members of within our own sub communities, we sometimes play like these ambassador roles, and no one can speak for the entire community. And I wonder how you think that translates to elected officials that we are seeing within your community, and how you think they're behaving, or if you think there's so many examples of people breaking the mold now, and what you've been able to witness from that, I guess.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that like oftentimes what I've seen is, and I recently had this conversation with someone at house too, because I was like, oh my God, like I feel like sometimes people expect me to cover so many issues that I don't even always know about, just
Yeah.
because like I'm the only person they know who's writing, who's Muslim. Um, I think in general, like a lot of elected officials, like it goes both ways, right? Like unfortunately, some I feel like people are like expecting a lot of, right? So when it comes to like, I've seen stories about Ilhan Omar before, right, where people are like, oh, like she didn't address this when she should have, or she had the opportunity to this, and it's kind of it's sad because like yes, this person is like a representative of a community because they're the only person you see. Maybe like I mean, there's also Rashida Tlaib, but like just in general, right? Like looking at the stat, and so many others. But when people will bring up like, oh, this person represents this community, they haven't said this. But then I think like when you kind of get involved in these type of when you get involved in advocacy, you kind of realize that you can only voice so much at one time.
Yeah.
And it's like we need to humanize the people that we're seeing. So I actually did an interview a while ago with the Rami. I don't know if you're familiar with the show on Hulu. And I remember, and this is like what I think of right away when during this conversation, I was speaking to him and I asked him, I'm like, how do you feel representing like the Muslim community on screen? And he literally shut me down. He was like, I don't represent the Muslim community. And it was like, and then I kind of like, at first I was like taken aback. I'm like, oh, like, what do you mean? And then he like went on and he explained, and I really liked his perspective. He's like, listen, I'm Arab. Like I represent my Arab Muslim experience.
Right.
He's like, if you look at it, there's so many different people who identify as like Muslim, for example. He's like, oh, South Asians, there's Black Muslims, there's like so many different types of Muslims. He's like, I can't encompass all of that. And like, I started reading all these reviews of the show and they were like, oh, like, there's no Muslim women in this show. It doesn't represent Muslims. But then it kind of was like, it's like sad, but like it goes back to like what represent it. Like finally we're getting that representation, but at the same time we're kind of criticizing it.
Right.
And the same thing, like I remember when you were going back to like voters, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was reading this post and it was like 37, I still remember them. It was like 37 Muslim people, like 37% of Muslims voted for Trump. And I'm like, who are these 37%? I was so irritated.
Right.
And it kind of goes back to the same thing. Like I immediately think about, I was like thinking about this recently because like I feel like we call out a lot of people like people will call out like white people, right, for being racist, but then I never used to look at like my own community, like, oh my god, my community has so much racism within it, like, against the Black community, like South Asians in general, like it's been like historically relevant. And then it goes back to like the representation. Like there was a show, Never Have I Ever, that came out on Netflix, and everyone was like, "Oh my god, I love this show." I watched it. I was offended. I'm like, "How can these things are like stereotypes?" But then I like talk to people, and they're like, "Oh, it was so good for like representation." But then it goes back to like, okay, yeah, it's representation, but like what representation is good and what representation is bad? And obviously, like I thought about it, I'm like, okay, this is Mindy Kaling's like actual experiences of she's saying what her experiences are. So what he's explaining obviously might be like there were like comments about like her aunt and stuff, and I'm like, that's a stereotype. Why would you have that? That's just gonna like enforce like more stereotypes of like Indian people. But I think it goes back to like your own experiences, right? Because of your own identity, you can't have that whole thing. And then talking about Kamala Harris, like I saw so many posts where people were just talking about how she was Indian. They're like, oh, the first ever South Asian vice president. Yeah. And that was erasing her Black identity. Right. And then I remember somebody else, like, and I had an argument like on Instagram with someone because they were like, oh, she doesn't even identify as Indian. She calls herself Black. And then if you like go to the root of that, I'm like, well, that's because like Indian people didn't accept her until she became vice president. Right. Like the fact that like for years, if people keep saying, oh, she's Black, she's Black, she's Black, it goes back to the whole, like, if somebody's going to say like, you're like, look at you being Black in not both identities, then obviously like you can't hate them or be upset if they call themselves just Black and not Indian. Like it's her choice what she wants to identify with. So I had this like argument with someone on that because it's like, it goes back to like, you can't expect someone to kind of identify the way you want. Like I used to always just kind of say I'm Punjabi, right? Because like I meet South Asian people who are also Punjabi. I'm like, oh, I'm Punjabi, but I wouldn't kind of break down that I'm like from the Pakistan part of Punjab, and people got offended by that. I was like, I'm not saying I'm not Pakistani. I'm just saying that I'm also Punjabi. I don't know. I feel like it's interesting how like no matter what you do, I feel like it's like unfortunate to say someone is going to have an issue. Like there's always going to be something that comes up when it comes to like culture and identity because it's such a personal thing.
Right. And it's such a, you know, it goes back to, you know, and a lot of white people who are not trying to listen to what is being said when we have these like nuanced conversations about culture are like, well, you go and make broad generalizations about white people, you know, like why is it the worst thing? Well, it's like, because in our culture, what we are taught in the United States is white culture. And when a lot of people meet a singular person of color, it's like that person is the ambassador for that culture. And it's like, it's just a very different, it's a very different standard, right? And you know, the United States is becoming more diversified, and you live in New Jersey, and you know that's you know, like it's a different community than, you know, rural. Like I lived in New York City for a while. I live outside of DC now. It's a very diverse area, but I grew up in South Florida, but in different parts of the country that I've traveled to, especially when I've canvassed in like the deep South, people would be like outright racist to me about like immigrants because of how I look. And then I'd be like, oh, well, I immigrated here when I was 6. So what do you think about, you know? And it's, I guess what I want to bring into this is that there is so much that we like, how we identify, right? And that we feel very strongly about that. But that also is in the context of our bicultural, tricultural upbringings, you know, and it's difficult to have those conversations. And so I wonder from what you've been seeing, if that is something, that ability to code switch is an asset that you are seeing in movements, or if you're seeing it as something that is kind of a double-edged sword, or something that's bad, where it's like, well, then people think we're disingenuous, right? Because like, oh, I'm not Punjabi enough, or oh, I'm not white enough, or I'm not American enough, whatever that might be.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say, I feel like I'm very like proud to be like brown, right? I'm like, yeah, I'm so
Yeah.
brown all the time now. But I wasn't always like this. I went to Islamic school up until 6th grade.
Mm,
I went to like public school after that. So it was a private school. I had like 10 kids in my class. Then I went to a public school and I'm like, whoa, there's so many kids here. And now there's like a lot of South Asians in my area. Like it's super populated. But when I went there, I would say like there was like 5 kids, right, who were
mhm,
South Asian, and I avoided them. Like I did not want to be
mhm,
with the South Asian kids. I don't know why. I feel like it was kind of like a inner rooted thing, but I remember like I was like I don't want to be like that like stereotype. Like I'm like, oh my God, I don't want oil in my hair. Like that's gross. I don't want like I'm like, do not pack me like like Pakistani lunch. Okay, don't do it. Like
mhm.
I was like very like
God, I
against
feel
it.
that deeply. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like very, very against it. And I
Mhm,
remember like I would, I guess I was like very, I don't know what happened. I would say it was probably like my junior or senior year by then. Suddenly, like, I just was like very, like, I'm like, I'm going to join the South Asian Club. And like, I think back to it, and I had like all these friends who weren't my friends. Like, I still, like, I had wrote this poem actually a while ago, and it was like about how like half my friends that I did have that were, and I'm not saying like white people are bad. I'm just like the white friends I did have that I wanted so hard to fit in with, they were
mhm.
so mean to me. And I like I think about it now and I'm like, why was I even trying to be friends with these people? Like
Right.
they would make fun of my culture. They'd be like, oh yeah, like, you know, look at that Indian girl with like oily hair and like make comments. And then I used to usually have like I guess because like people would, and I don't know, for me, I'm pretty like light, people say, for someone who's South Asian. So people think I'm like mixed and make like comments about that, like, oh, like, you know, like you're different because like you're not fully like Pakistani. And I'm like, well, I don't know, like it's like weird. I don't remember. I'm pretty sure I corrected them, but now that I think about it, sometimes I'm like, did I like, or did I just kind of go with it?
Mhm.
Um, and then as I got older, I feel like I became like more like, and I also think it's because like the generation that we kind of have is like a lot of millennials were like, okay, like let's reclaim like this narrative,
Yeah.
like, you know, being like brown and being like Asian or being like Latina is like cool, like you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like suddenly like it was like a big thing, but
Mhm.
remember like beauty standard wise too, like there were so many different things. Like I was like, I don't want to like have my hair too long. Like my mom would be like, oh, like don't cut your hair too short, and I'm like, no, I want my hair to be like shorter. It can't be like long because I'd be like it's gonna look foggy, and I'd make like all these
It's
comments like
so funny hearing you say that now because I know you're so proud of your long hair now.
I have such a long hair. Yeah. I'm actually planning on donating it, so I'm like waiting until it gets a certain length. But yeah, no, I ended up being like it's like weird to think about it because I was completely different. Like I wouldn't wanna like wear like you know like South Asian clothes to like school when they had like culture days, all that stuff. And now I'm like the complete opposite. I'm like posting all these like photos all the time. I'm always like, okay, I'll wear like a I remember when we were younger, my mom would be like, go to ShopRite, grab a cake when we're going to someone's house. I'm like, no, I can't get out of the car. I'm wearing like brown clothes. And now like, I'm like, whatever, I'm gonna own it. I'll look so good. Like things like that. But it's like interesting to see how that changes. I definitely think now a lot of people are more open to like culture, but
Mhm.
it's also like it goes back to that thing where like it's kind of reclaimed. And I think because there's more representation, people feel, but the same thing like you said that I don't think I'm like white passing, but I get like a lot of comments where people think I'm half, or they'll make comments about like other people who don't kind of like because of language. So since I was like born and raised here, I've seen like people talk over other people. So my last job when I worked at as a linguistic counselor, I would often see like one of my colleagues had an accent. People kind of ignore her and then just ask me questions when she was
Mm,
like presenting, and it didn't make sense to me because it's like, okay, this is the expert in this situation, but you're asking me.
right.
And then people would make comments like with my parents too, like, oh, I don't really understand them. I'm like, my mom speaks British English. Like, how do you not like her English is like so much better than mine. Like, how do you not understand her? And I'm just like standing there, like, okay, like my mom constantly corrects me. She's like, you're not speaking well enough. And I'm just like, what? And I think it goes back to like the whole thing, like when I was younger, people would make like comments about like hijabi women and how like they're like, oh yeah, they're so oppressed. Like, you know, you're so lucky you don't wear hijab. And they see my mom, they're confused and they're like, wait, like your mom wears hijab, but you don't. And I'm like, because it's my mom's choice. And
Yeah.
I think it honestly like it goes back to like ignorance, right? I
Yeah.
feel like for so long, especially like a lot of kind of misconceptions do come from the media. So
Mhm.
we constantly have these like different headlines and we don't have that representation. This kind of gets passed on for year to year. But then it also goes back to like the culture in itself that if we don't have that representation, we're also to blame because you don't see people like us in these fields because we don't go for them. So like I've seen so many kind of posts where people are like, I wish there were more South Asians in the media. And I'm like, but then South Asians are like, their parents don't tell them
Right.
not to go in the media. So it's like, how could you expect that representation if you're not willing to give it?
Yeah.
I know, I feel like we like kind of diverted.
No. I mean, this is all, like I said at the beginning, like the personal is so political and so much. We're constantly asking. I mean, we talk about it at Daily Kos constantly, but in media and journalism generally, it is extremely white. It is extremely male. It is extremely cis. It is extremely Christian or Judeo-Christian. You know, like it is that, and it's like, how are we going to? It's great to have candidates that represent a wider, perspective. But if people aren't writing from a similar perspective about these candidates, like what lens are we really tapping into? But I know that you have to go soon. So I kind of wanted to wrap it up with one last question, because everyone I know is super all hands on deck this week and next week, and honestly, maybe for the next foreseeable future. But I wanted to know, and maybe this is cheesy of me to say in a time when everything has been so terrible, but what, as someone who is very in tune with their culture, with their identity, and is also a trending news writer in 2021, what is your silver lining or hope of what has come out of the past, I guess, let's say the last 4 years? Because it's been a devastating 4 years.
I feel like I haven't, honestly speaking, like I think it's like sad to say, I'm gonna try to be hopeful, but I kind of like
it's okay to say you don't have any,
like that I thought of. I mean, there's like a few policies that I hope to see, like that kind of Trump like enabled and carried on to right now, like that are going into the Biden administration that I hope are going to get rid of. I mean, Biden said that he's going to address the Muslim ban. Then there's also with immigrants with like visas. I think like even though I guess like I'm privileged enough to not have any family members who are on like H1 or H4 visas and like all that. Those issues are very close to me because of the work that I used to do. I used to see a lot of women suffer because they weren't able to obtain green cards and they were facing domestic violence. So the issues like that when it comes to just in general, like immigrant issues, when H1 visas, H4 visas, those always very appeal to me when I like read about those. So I know right now there's been a lot of restrictions on that going into the Biden administration. I hope that those are addressed. I mean, he said he's going to address them. So I hope that happens. Outside of that, I don't know. I just I'm like hopeful for like people of color, because I feel like, like we kind of have fought so hard in the last 4 years that I think it'll be nice to like finally, I mean, obviously like the bigots and the racists aren't going to just like go away overnight, right? When inauguration happens. But I do think that it will make a difference that their like leader is no longer in the House. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping that we see change and more like positivity and like less like sad news that always comes up of like hate crimes and all that, especially because like this last year, there's been such a big increase in hate crimes. I'm hoping that lessens, but I don't know. Like I kind of am like, I feel like I'm in that, I'm excited, but at the same time, I'm nervous because I don't want to be too hopeful. And I can understand that sounds like super negative, but I mean, representation wise, I'm super excited. I've like seen like such like on Halloween this year, people like were at home, but just like dressing up and posting pictures. I saw so many people post pictures of like their kids like dressed up as like leaders, and in general, like, like just like people like as like presidents and stuff. And I thought that was cute because it's like, like you act like I would have never imagined like seeing someone who like looks like me, right, in like the White House. So now like it's exciting to like have that representation. But the one thing I know from like the South Asian community that I hope that happens, and I'm like working on a piece on this, is just in general like broader acceptance. I had a conversation with Jay about this, how like people keep saying like kind of like picking and choosing identity when it comes to Kamala Harris, where they're like, oh my God, she's Indian. And I really hope that like that bridges the communities together now that like she is literally both. So I hope that communities come together more because of this this year and generally later on, and we're able to have more solidarity between the different communities of color there are. but I don't know, like I don't really have like I feel like I'm just kind of like winging it. It's like, see what happens.
You know what? I think that that is like the perfect representation of like being a brown young woman now. It's like, I'm not holding my breath, but let's go. You know, like,
Yeah.
well, I think that that's pretty much all we have time for. But thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for everyone who tuned in and watched. This is going to stay on YouTube. So if you missed a part of it, by all means, go check it out. Give us a like, leave comments, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you so much. Aysha, I really appreciate your time.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.